Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our voter data targeting and political field planning trainings. This is the second part of our two-part series. And if you haven't watched part one yet, I would recommend you start there. I'm Liam McMahon, still, Civic Engagement Coordinator at Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota. We're going to kick off this training in just a second, but I do want to just first thank you for watching this training and to say that if you have any questions or things you'd like to talk about in more detail, please do reach out to me. I'm going to start screen sharing the slide deck for today's training, and my email is there on the first slide. It is mcmahonl@faithandmin.org. Really, please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about anything, want to talk about in more detail about how to do something that I talked about in this training. I would be more than happy to talk. So we are going to be picking up from where we left off in part one. So I just want to do a quick recap of that. Say again, if you haven't already watched part one, go back and start there, because what I'm about to talk about now is not going to make an awful lot of sense if you haven't already watched that. So when we finished up part one, we had talked through how to conduct an initial political analysis in a hypothetical scenario where Dodge and Olmsted counties were voting on a levy to raise funds for public schools. We did some modeling around ideology, identifying how many voters in those two counties are in our base, opposition, and are persuadable. We also did some work identifying who actually votes in those two counties. Today, we're going to take the next couple of steps from that analysis and start looking at how we turn it into a full-blown plan to win this election. The first step there is that we need to figure out how many votes we actually need to get in order to win. How do we do that? Well, first we're going to look at the number of registered voters there are currently in these two counties, as well as at voter turnout in the last number of elections. In Van, there are 109,000 registered voters in these two counties. However, one important thing to know about Van is that there's always a lag between the data that the Secretary of State has and what shows up in Van. Because if I moved and I was updating my registration, I'd have to do it with the Secretary of State, and it would be in the Secretary of State's database for a little bit before it shows up in the voter file that we have access to. The Secretary of State keeps an updated count of the number of registered voters in every county on their website, and the URL is linked in this presentation. It's there, that long URL. According to the latest data that the SOS has, there are actually 113,000 registered voters across these two counties. Okay, so now we know how many registered voters there are, but how many of them are actually going to turn out to vote? Let's start by looking at what voter turnout was across these two counties over the last several elections. In 2014, it was 58%. In 2016, it was 82%. In 2018, it was 74%. And in 2020, it was 86%. How do I know that? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about how we actually calculate voter turnout. To calculate those voter turnout statistics, I went to the Secretary of State's elections results website. There, you can download an Excel file that has the full election results by precinct across the state for every election. I'm actually going to stop sharing this slide deck and jump over to Excel and walk through how you do that. So this is the Excel file of the 2020 election results all across the state. And this is what it looks like when you first open the file. If you click on precinct results, it will show you the results for all of the precincts all across the state. You'll be able to see all sorts of voting data. It's going to be hard to interpret. There's an awful lot here. So you're going to need to make a couple of tweaks to the file to make it legible for yourself and anyone else who's going to look at it. So the first thing to do is to filter. That's a feature in Excel that allows you to basically find specific data. So sort and filter, and then where it says county name here, I'm going to filter to just Dodge and Olmsted counties. So select Dodge, select Olmsted. And now I just have the precincts that are in those two counties. Within the Excel file is data on how many people were registered to vote as of 7 a.m. on election day, how many registered on election day, and how many total people voted. That is a little bit further to the right here. In column T here, we have registered as of 7 a.m. Column U has EDR, which stands for election day registration. And then over in column Z, we have the total number of people that voted. So if I wanted to figure out the voter turnout statistic for the first precinct here, Ashland Township, what I would do is add column T and column U together. So that's 221 plus 24, that's 245. And then the total voting number is 217. So I would divide 217 by 245. 217 divided by 245, that's 89%. So in Ashland Township in 2020, the voter turnout was 89%. And we actually want to do that for every precinct in these counties because we're just looking for the data across the two counties. But that's just a quick how you can do it in Excel. If you want to include all of them, you can use a formula that will enable you to do that as well. So just jump back over to the slides. There we go. Okay. So that is how you calculate voter turnout percentage based off of the election results. But that voter turnout percentage is probably going to be a little bit higher than what the Secretary of State will say the official voter turnout percentage is. That's because the Secretary of State has access to another set of data that we don't have access to, which is an estimate of how many eligible voters there are in a given place. So that's people who are registered to vote, plus people who are not registered but are eligible. So folks who have recently moved and haven't updated their registration since they came from another state, people who've recently turned 18 and haven't registered yet, folks who recently became citizens and haven't registered yet. All that we can look at is the total number of people registered to vote. So to get a truer estimate of the actual voter turnout percentage, we would probably want to subtract by 2 to 3 percentage points. But what we have here is pretty good, solid data that will help us to estimate of the number of registered voters, how many are likely to vote in the next election. So what does the historic voter turnout suggest about turnout in this election? Well, if we averaged the turnout over these last 4 elections, the average is 75%. However, that number is just one estimate, and it's slightly skewed by the fact that the 2018 and 2020 elections were each unique in their own ways. The presence of Donald Trump in the White House and on the ballot led to historic levels of voter turnout, both in support of him and in opposition to him. And that level of historic voter turnout is not guaranteed to happen again in 2022. So taking 75% as a starting point, I'm going to propose a range of voter turnout that we might see this year, between 68% and 78%. To try and get a specific estimate, we want to also consider national and state political trends. Those tell us that Trump is not on the ballot and that voter enthusiasm this year is lower than it was in 2018 and 2020. So that means we're likely looking at a voter turnout on the lower end of our estimate. I'm going to put it at 70%. So how many votes would that be? If 70% of our 113,000 voters turned out, that would be 79,619 votes cast. What if that's wrong? Well, that's why we have a range of voter turnout estimates, so that we can make a plan for how to respond. And that brings us to our next step, which is estimating a win number, or the number of votes we need to win this election. Using our range of turnout estimates, we can start to figure out how many votes we need to get to win this election. When identifying a win number, it's helpful to consider 2 different things. What is the bare minimum number of votes that we need to get to win? And how many votes might we need if voter turnout is higher than expected? To calculate the first number, we need to figure out how many votes it would take to get to 50% of the vote plus 1 vote. For the second number, we want to know what 52% of the votes cast would be. That 52% number is what we will eventually use as our win number. So at 70% turnout, we're looking at 79,619 votes cast. 50% plus 1 there would be 39,889 votes. 52% would be 41,402 votes. That's our win number. However, we don't want to just stop there. We also want to look at what our win number would be if voter turnout was a little bit different, but still within our estimated range of 68 to 78%. If we felt that voter turnout would be on the higher end of our estimate, then we would choose either the 73% turnout or 78% turnout win number. I won't bore you by reading those numbers out, but they're there on the slide. I just want to take another second to talk about why do I recommend using the 52% figure as your win number? That's because it's a lot better to shoot for an ambitious goal and come up a little bit short of it, but still give yourself some margin for error to win, than it is to be shooting just for 50 plus 1 and to come up a little bit short of it and lose an election by half a percentage point. It's really helpful to have some buffer area built in. Who are the people that we need to reach to get to that win number, and how are we going to reach them? So now that we have our win number, we're going to start planning out what voters we need to talk to in order to get them to support this ballot measure. To do that, let's review the data from part 1 about our tiers of vote propensity in our base and persuasion universes. Within the van, there are 109,000 registered voters, and almost 66,000 of them are likely voters. If we assumed that all of the likely voters were going to vote, that leaves another 13,000 to 14,000 voters to come from our other tiers of vote propensity, if voter turnout actually is going to be around that 79,000 figure. And we can see that the likely voters have significantly more opposition than base voters. That means that in order to win, we're going to need to do some persuasion work with the likely voters, as well as ensure as many base voters as possible turn out in the likely voters cohort and in the lower tiers of vote propensity. How far down the tiers of vote propensity should we go? We need to try and reach as many voters as possible. And due to the limits of modeling and the technology that we use to reach voters, we have to cast a net much broader than just 41,402 people. Why? Well, there are a bunch of reasons. Not everybody modeled as our base is actually going to agree with us, and not everybody modeled as persuasion will truly be persuadable. Modeling is not perfect, and there will also be, modeling is not perfect when it comes to ideology, and then there also are just people who are not going to have enough data to reach. There will be lots of people in our target universes that we can't reach because they don't have a phone number in the voter file, or they just won't answer their phone, or they won't come to the door if we knocked on their door. So we cast as broad a net as possible and try to reach as many different voters as we can through all of the different tools in our toolbox. Knowing that we need as many base voters as possible to conduct our base outreach, I'm going to create a universe in VAN that includes our modeled base voters across 4 different tiers of vote propensity: likely voters, vote retention, lower tier likely voter, and potential surge voter. Collectively, that's 27,512 people. For our persuasion outreach, I'm going to create a universe in VAN that includes modeled persuasion across 3 different tiers of vote propensity: likely voters, vote retention, and lower tier likely voters. This universe includes 30,517 people. That is a lot of people. That's so many people. We're not going to be able to reach all of them, but we can reach a lot of them. And depending on what happens with the scale of our program, we may also expand it to talk to some modeled opposition through a targeted parents talking to parents program, as well as through a relational program, which I will be coming to shortly. How are we going to reach these voters? We're going to call and door knock as many of them as possible, but we won't be able to talk to all of them that way. Some people won't have phone numbers in the voter file, others won't answer their phone, and many won't be home when we knock on the door. And even if people do answer their phone or door, they're likely to not know who we are, like on an individual level, or why we're reaching out to them, and may see a conversation about voting in this referendum as a very transactional process. Not to mention, that is an awful lot of people to try to call and door knock. So how do we get around those issues? The first way is through relational organizing, or using existing relationships to reach people where they're at. Relational organizing should be the first step in any field plan. because conversations with people that you know and trust are by far the most impactful way of getting someone to go vote for the issues you're organizing around, not to mention feeling more authentic and less transactional, especially when connected to broader power building and not just one election. Every one of your leaders that is working on your program should make a list of at least 30 people in their own network that they will reach out to about this referendum, as well as about the work going on here, and invite them in. There are relational organizing tools like Empower and Reach that allow you to import contacts from your phone and match people to the voter file, which is the list of registered voters across the state. Relational outreach will also help you talk to voters you would not have otherwise, as there are some who are likely not in your target universe or do not even have a phone number in the voter file, but that one of your leaders might have contact information for. If you have the data capacity, you can even work on the back end of the voter data to make sure folks who are getting relational outreach won't also be called by a random leader in a phone bank. That's something that we can talk about in more detail if you want to reach out. To win this campaign, though, we're going to need to do even more than that, because we still won't be able to reach everyone. So how do we fill in the gaps? By doing things like buying digital advertisements and sending paid mail pieces to folks' houses, which is possible with a relatively small budget. You can utilize the targeted lists created in Van for targeting digital ads and paid mail pieces. If you're running a bigger campaign and have the money for it, you might even buy a TV ad late in the campaign. Now that we've done all of that, we can start thinking about how we would build out a field plan. How many doors and phones do we need to would we need to knock and to call to try to talk to all of these voters 1 time, 2 times, 3 times? How many total doors and phones do these different universes even have? How many conversations could we have with folks? Within Van, you can see how many doors and phone numbers there are for people in your lists, which will help you to estimate how many passes you would need to make and how many volunteer shifts you might need to make all of those passes. If you have the budget to hire paid canvassers, it will help you estimate your paid canvas outreach too. I'm just going to stop sharing in a list. There are all sorts of handy shortcuts within Van that will show you how many people, how many phone numbers, how many doors there are for a given list. So I have a list pulled up here that is 466 people, and you'll see that just when I load the list, it will say how many phones and doors there are. So you can see we have phone numbers for 326 people here. There's a breakdown of how many of those phones are cell phones, how many are landlines, and how many doors there are. So the list is going to be bigger than the number of doors that you actually have to go and door knock. Just jumping back to the slides here. As you build out your field plan, you'll also start to see holes in your capacity. We don't have enough people to knock all of these doors. You might want to start thinking about where it's most important and most helpful to knock. Denser urban turf will go faster than rural spread out turf. And if you don't have enough people to make all the phone calls you want, you might want to think about who is likeliest to answer the phone. In some places, it may be people with cell phones. In others, it might be people with landlines. You can distinguish between those 2 types of phones in Van, which is what I was just screen sharing. Okay, but how do we actually turn that sort of philosophical approach into like hard math that'll help us figure out how many people we can talk to, what capacity we need? Well, let's start with the doors. Within our broader universe of base and persuasion voters, there are fewer doors than there are people, which makes sense since there are going to be families who live together in our universes. The 27,512 people in our base universe are spread across 20,236 doors, while the 30,517 people in the persuasion universe are spread across 21,180 doors. All told, that's 41,416 doors. When it comes time for people to actually go out and door knock, we're going to put these 2 universes together, which is pretty easy to do in Van. If you save them both as saved lists, you can just create a new list that adds them together. That's going to help make our turf denser and let us knock more doors in less time. How long would it actually take to knock all of those doors? If we assume that a volunteer leader in a 3-hour shift can knock 50 doors, which is a pretty safe assumption in, fairly dense, relatively urban to dense suburban turf, we would need 828 volunteer shifts for one pass, 1,656 for two passes, and 2,484 for three passes. That's just an estimate, in part because these turfs are not all the same. We've got urban, suburban, and rural turf across these two counties. So there are going to be places where the turfs are bigger and can be knocked quickly, and others where we'll need a car to drive from house to house. That's definitely something to consider in your shift math, as is who your leaders are, how quickly they can get around, if they have access to cars. Younger folks are going to be able to knock a little bit faster than older folks because they're going to walk a little bit faster. So all of those things should be considered, and you should really be considering the experience that your leaders are going to have while knocking doors as well. You don't want to give them terrible turf that takes forever and is really far away. Along with that, you need to think about how many volunteer leaders you're actually going to have and how many shifts they can fill. If it is significantly fewer than the number you would need to complete this universe, then you need to make some strategic decisions. You can choose to remove some voters from this universe to shrink the number of doors to knock, or you can focus door knocking on the densest turf, where you'll be able to knock the most doors in the least amount of time. Those are judgment calls that you as campaigns and power organizations are going to have to make. Okay, how about the math on the phones? Like with the doors, there are fewer phone numbers than there are people across our base and persuasion universes. Both because there are people who live in the same house and because there are people who don't have a phone number in the voter file. There are 27,512 people in our base universe, and we have phone numbers for 17,614 of them. Of that bigger number, almost 9,000 are cell phones. Meanwhile, there are 30,517 people in our persuasion universe, and we have phone numbers for almost 19,000 of them. Of that 19,000, about 7,000 are cell phones. Phone response rates are higher on cell phones than they are on landlines, although in southern Minnesota, there is going to be a higher proportion of people with landlines than there are in the Twin Cities, and they'll be answering their landlines at higher rates than they will be in the Twin Cities. Okay, so how long would it actually take to call all these people? A volunteer leader who is like well-trained and knows the system that you're using can call 100 people in a 3-hour shift. To do 3 passes of cells and landlines across all of these universes, we would need to fill about 1,050 volunteer shifts with some extra capacity built in for attrition and technical difficulties. Unlike the doors, with phones, it's easy to use different universes for different phone banks, and you can give out different missions to folks who really want to make calls to your base or persuasion universe. And you can see there that it would take 270 shifts to do 3 passes of the base cells, 120 for the persuasion cells. All that math is just there. Okay, so how do you do that in Van? I already shared my screen, just showed you where you can go to see how many doors and how many phones there are. When you're creating a list, actually, let me jump back into Van, and I will just show you how you can create a list and look for specific kinds of phone numbers. So if you are creating a list, you can, like you've got all the different fields that you can include, and under phones where it says is a cell question mark, if you're looking for the cell phones, you can just select verified cells and likely cells. And if you're just looking for landlines, you can select likely not a cell, not a cell. Sorry, computer difficulties there. So congratulations, you just created a field plan for your campaign. What comes next? Well, before we actually put it into action, you're going to want to double check that we've not made any big mistakes as we were putting it together. So before really beginning the field plan in earnest, which is likely to happen in mid to late August, we should test our modeling and our assumptions about the electorate. Do some testing door knocks and phone banking and see how people respond when asked about candidates and issues. Look to see if the modeled base and modeled persuasion are behaving the way they would if the modeling is right. That would mean the vast majority of base voters are aligned with us on the issues and candidates, while with the persuasion cohort, it would be more split, with hopefully at least 50% supporting our issues and candidates. if you're at the point where 80% of the persuasion universe is supportive, it might not be persuadable enough. You might need to add in more people who are in our initial cut of opposition. It also might mean that the results you're getting back in are saying that you need to tweak the language that you're using in your scripts to be better appealing to our base or to our persuasion voters. Listen to your leaders and get a sense from them of what's working and what isn't. Make adjustments and then get ready to roll after Labor Day. All right, that is the end of our training. Thanks again for watching. I just want to again say, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions if there are things that you want to talk about in more detail. I am happy to chat with anybody. My email is again mcmahonl@faithandmin.org. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.